If you've always said to yourself that you would love to learn how to sew your own clothes, this video is going to be perfect for you. Hey guys, I'm Tammy and welcome back to my channel. I've actually been sewing for 6 years and I can say without a doubt it's the best skill that I've ever learned. So whether you have a sewing machine and it might be gathering dust in the back of your wardrobe, or you don't even have a sewing machine yet but you want to know where to get started, this video is going to be perfect for you. So the first thing you want to do is buy a sewing machine. Now your first sewing machine does not have to be expensive. It can be really cheap. My first machine was actually £80 on Amazon and it was the Brother LS14S. I still have that sewing machine today. It works really well. Obviously behind me I've upgraded to a much more advanced machine, but that beginner machine that I bought 6 years ago still works perfectly fine and it's a great beginner friendly machine. I have a whole YouTube video showing you what to look for in your first machine and how to go about shopping for one. I'll link that down below in case you're interested. But essentially your first sewing machine just needs to have 3 key stitches, and that is a zigzag stitch, a straight stitch and a buttonhole stitch, and it's the basic stitches that you'll use on most projects. These 3 stitches will get you through the majority of your sewing journey. One thing you definitely want to look for is make sure your machine has a functioning light so you can sew in the dark. It doesn't always have to be light outside, because sometimes if you shop for a machine secondhand, things like that don't actually work, so you might have to amend them before you start sewing with it. But once you have one, spend some time going through the actual manual that comes with your sewing machine. Honestly, these things are super useful and have a lot of the information already inside them. I know when you first look at it, it can look really intimidating. You're like, what on earth do all these words mean? But it's a really useful thing to just go through it, see how they actually recommend to do certain things on your machine, because it actually might differ depending on what brand you're using. Once you've had a quick flip through your manual, I would recommend just getting some scrap pieces of fabric you might have lying around, even just old bits of cloth. You can actually even use paper from your printer and just use that to start sewing straight lines onto the fabric or the paper, just so you can understand how a sewing machine actually feels. It's kind of like a car pedal, so the harder or more pressure you put on the pedal, the faster it will go. So it can feel really scary when you first put your foot down. You're like, whoa, it's going really fast. But if you just take your time and try to sew slowly, then you'll understand how it should feel like when you're sewing stitches. The second thing to do is to buy some basic sewing tools. Now you really don't need much to sew. I'll share a few of my absolute essentials if you are a beginner for you to get started sewing. The first thing you're going to want to have are sewing machine needles. I've got 2 here right in front of me, and this is a universal needle, and I've also got ballpoint needles. You'll need both depending on what you're going to be sewing. Universal needles are used for woven fabrics and they come with different sizes, so you can actually pair the needle size with what fabric you're using. And then ballpoint needles are used for stretch fabrics, and it's basically just a different needle shape just so it doesn't tear the fabric when you're sewing it. If you are just completely starting out fresh and you're not going to sew anything stretchy, just get a pack of universal needles. You also need some pins and some clips right here, and this is what you're going to use when you're sewing your seams together to hold the fabric in place. I like to use these pins. They're like glass beaded ones. I have them on a magnetic board as well so they don't fall over. And then I also have a whole pack of clips. They look like this. They're just plastic ones, and they're really great as well for holding seams together if you don't actually like using pins. Pins can be a bit tricky to hold, whereas these ones you just kind of open and close and it goes really nicely onto fabric. You also need some thread, which I've got right here. Now when I first started sewing, I did just get a pack of like 50 from Amazon for like £5, and that's obviously really good to practice with, but when you start actually sewing clothes, you want to use high quality thread because it will last longer and also the stitches will stitch better. So I like to use the Gooseman brand. They're everywhere and they're just really good and high quality. You definitely want to buy thread that comes in a range of colors because you want to match the thread color to the thing that you're sewing. You also want some chalk or a disappearing pen. Basically you just need a tool to mark certain things onto the fabric. I like to use chalk if it's hard to mark onto fabric, and then if the fabric is white or it's really easy to mark onto, I like to use this Frixion pen. It's an erasable pen and it disappears with steam. If you're making things really just to practice with, you can just use a pencil or even a pen. Just be aware that it might stain the fabric and it'll be really hard to get out. You also need some scissors. So I've got this one here, which is a really sharp pair, and then an ordinary pair right here. The reason why you need 2 is because you want a nice sharp pair of scissors that you're only going to use for cutting out fabric, and then you want another pair of scissors that's like a normal general pair, and that's what we're going to use to cut out paper patterns or anything like that. You don't want to cut paper with your fabric scissors because it can dull the blade, and in general it's just not great practice to do that. You'll also want a ruler. Obviously you probably have one of these lying around somewhere in your home home, so you don't have to go ahead and buy one. It's mainly just for if you're marking things onto fabric and you don't actually want to have a pattern. It's useful to get a nice straight line, and you can use a pen or that disappearing pen or chalk to mark onto your fabric. You'll also want to have an iron and an ironing board. You probably already have one at home. I got this one on Amazon. It's actually broken at the moment, but you want an iron because when you're sewing, it's really important to press your seams because it makes the final garment look so much more professional once it's finished. And in general, it's just great practice to press after every step. You'll also want a tape measure. This one's actually retractable, so if I open it up, it's flexible, and then I can press this button and it goes back into place. I definitely recommend buying a retractable one because then it doesn't get tangled up and stuff like that. But you just basically want a tape measurer to help measure your body when you're taking your own measurements. And in general, it's just great practice to have if you have to measure something really quickly on your pattern piece. As a beginner, when you're sewing, you're really prone to making mistakes, but that's all part of the process. You definitely want to buy a seam ripper, and it looks like this. And what you use it for is to unpick your stitches. So if you make a mistake, you just use this to unpick the thread, and then you can start the step again without having to ruin any of your fabric. I also recommend getting a simple sewing book to get started, and this is just really great to help you understand different key sewing techniques and terms, and it's easier to have a reference point so you can use that to practice with. I'll definitely recommend a few down below for you to check out. The next thing you want to do, now you have all your sewing tools ready to go, is to start with a simple sewing project. For your absolute first sewing project, I recommend choosing something that involves zero fitting, just so you can understand how to work with fabric and all the steps it takes to sew an actual item. YouTube honestly has so many free amazing tutorials for you to follow. I've actually got my own range of beginner friendly projects for you to try, like this beginner friendly tote bag and also a scrunchie pattern for you to get started. I'll leave some links down below on where you can find some beginner friendly projects to start with. Something as simple as starting off with a tote bag honestly is such a great way to get started because you can take your time sewing something that requires zero fitting, and also as soon as you're done with it, you can wear it straight away. I've personally found that sometimes if you start with a project that's too difficult, it can feel pretty overwhelming, which is why I recommend simple projects like a tote bag, because the one that I have comes with a video tutorial, so you can literally see step by step how to make it and you can wear it straight away. But whatever project you decide to make, just make sure you use cotton fabric. That's because cotton is really easy to sew, it's very beginner friendly, doesn't really move and slip and slide when you're sewing with it, and it also presses really well with an iron. You want to avoid fabrics like silk or anything too slippery because it's really hard to sew with if you are a complete beginner. After you've mastered sewing a few basic projects using YouTube videos, then the last thing I recommend doing is using a sewing pattern. Sewing patterns come in all different formats. You can either get them in printed formats or you can get them digitally, so they're PDFs that you can download and use at home. You'll want to find a pattern that isn't complicated to use, is beginner friendly, and also aligns with the style of garment that you want to make. I like to make easy to follow sewing patterns that are really easy to sew, they're beginner friendly, and a lot of them come with video tutorials, so there's literally no guesswork on your end on how to make it. I personally like to sew things that are really comfortable and chic looking, so for complete beginners, I recommend choosing a pattern like the Rhea dress or the Amelia skirt. They're both sewing patterns that have a looser fit and also don't use fabric that's stretchy, so it's going to be much easier to sew. You can use fabric like cotton, linen or viscose to make these patterns depending on how flowy and drapey you want the final garment to look like. I always get messages like this from my audience. Honestly, it makes me feel so happy inside to know that I've inspired people to actually start sewing, or they've made clothing they feel super proud of and wear every single day. That is the best feeling in the world. My whole aim is to make sewing more accessible and enjoyable, and to make sewing patterns that you actually enjoy wearing and making. And honestly, when I get feedback like this, it just makes me feel so happy and just wants to push me even further to make even more patterns for you to try. Once you find the pattern that you want to make, you want to go ahead and find some fabric that will work well with it. Now, I have a whole YouTube video on how to shop for fabric, which I'll leave linked down below. But in general, like I said, I recommend things like cotton, linen or viscose. For the Amelia skirt, if you want to use cotton, it will give a bit more of a structured look. If you want a bit more floaty look, I recommend using viscose. Viscose can be a bit slippery to work with, but it is definitely easier to sew than something like satin or silk. Again, if you've never shopped for fabric before and it feels a bit overwhelming hearing these different fabric types, definitely give that video down below a watch where I take you through how I personally shop for fabric, and I make it really easy for you to understand how you can also shop for fabric online. Sewing is definitely a process that takes time and patience, but honestly, once you understand the fundamentals and you go ahead of learning how to create something, it feels incredible and so rewarding to actually hold something that you made with your bare hands. I honestly can't describe that feeling of being able to wear a top or a dress or anything that you've made, because it just feels amazing and it's such a cool thing to show people something that you've made. You can change the way clothes fit you, how they look. You can basically design a whole wardrobe for yourself. Honestly, if you want to learn one skill this year, sewing will not disappoint you. I hope you enjoyed this video and it's given you a really clear vision on where to get started if you want to start sewing today. I have a whole bunch of sewing tutorials on here for free. I also have 20 plus sewing patterns for you to try if you are a complete beginner. I'll leave a link down below on where you can find them. Let me know in the comments if you want to start sewing and what your dream project would be. Personally, when I first started sewing, I really wanted to make dresses that kind of fit my style, and that's exactly why I created the patterns that I have. I hope this video gives you that push to start sewing this year, because honestly, it's the best skill that I've ever learned and I always recommend people to start learning. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more from me. I'll see you in the next one.